Patrick Henry refused to attend the convention because he said he smelled a rat. How's that for a dramatic start? Today's explainer dives into a really fascinating and frankly highly specific set of source documents. These texts interpret America's founding not as this great triumph of democracy, but actually as a covert corporate takeover. It's a wild ride, so let's get into it.
The constitutional era. Today, we're going to objectively analyze the rather unconventional claims made in our source texts about this pivotal moment in American history. We'll be mapping out their completely unique, alternative legal theories on how the United States government was really founded.
So here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll start with the Article's ideal, move on to the 1787 Convention claims, break down the idea of 3 jurisdictional constitutions, look at the administrative state, and finally wrap up with reclaiming sovereignty.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the Article's ideal, basically a common law utopia.
To really wrap our heads around these texts, we first have to look at their idealized version of the past. Our sources look back at the 1777 Articles of Confederation as practically a perfect system. They see it as a decentralized, common law utopia for free inhabitants, totally, completely free of a federal judiciary. And they contrast this directly with the U.S. Constitution, which they argue established a centralized, corporate framework ruled by a, in their words, despotic federal judiciary.
The authors point to some very specific structural elements of the Articles to back this up. For instance, delegates? They only served 1-year terms and were subject to immediate recall, so absolutely no lifetime politicians. But most importantly, they emphasized that sovereign state citizens retained all the ultimate power locally. There were no superior federal judges to dictate equity or admiralty law, the law of the sea, over the individual states. According to these texts, this highly decentralized structure was the ultimate safeguard against tyranny.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 1787 Convention claims a corporate coup.
Okay, so if the Articles were so perfect, why on earth replace them? Well, the source texts are pretty explicit here. They claim the Constitution was drafted, and I quote, behind closed doors and with armed sentries outside to make sure nobody was eavesdropping. They really play up the fact that this convention was held in total secrecy while staunch Republicans like Thomas Jefferson were conveniently out of the country in France. The whole point, allegedly, was to usurp power from the common people and hand it over to a centralized, corporate-style government.
Which brings us to Section 3, 3 jurisdictional constitutions, a service contract matrix.
Now we're transitioning into what is honestly the most intricate claim in these documents. Our sources argue that there isn't just one U.S. Constitution. There are actually 3, and they don't view these as successions, like one replacing the other. No, they see them as service contracts that delegate distinct powers across 3 totally separate jurisdictions. You've got the 1787 Federal Constitution governing the land, the 1789 Territorial Constitution governing water and international sea jurisdictions, and the 1790 Municipal Constitution governing the air. According to the authors, the American government is the overarching employer, and these 3 federal constitutions merely created employee subcontractors. It's like a giant jurisdictional puzzle. Building directly on that framework, the authors map out what they call a British territorial subcontractor. They say this entity was established by the 1789 Territorial Constitution. They argue this entity actually operates as a democracy under admiralty law rather than a true common law republic. In their view, it effectively manages federal legal persons, what you and I would commonly call U.S. citizens, as mere employees or franchises of a massive corporation.
All right, on to Section 4, the administrative state, subjects of the corporation.
To understand how the sources view the modern-day consequences of all these historical shifts, we really have to look at how they define the word administration. In the universe of these texts, administration is literally defined as holding an incompetent in trust and regulating his use of property and his behavior. Yeah, they argue that the government has totally abandoned the true tripartite separation of powers, trading it in for an administrative state that treats everyday citizens as incompetent wards whose lives and property just have to be managed.
So what was the turning point? According to the sources, the ultimate linchpin in this whole timeline is the 14th Amendment. They assert that it introduced Roman civil law and created these new federal corporate citizens. By doing this, they claim citizens literally became collateral for public debt. They're saying your sweat equity is mortgaged by the Federal Reserve. Furthermore, they argue this system replaced the original common law courts with mere administrative agencies that are essentially just masquerading as a judicial branch.
Finally, Section 5, reclaiming sovereignty, the indemnity process.
Okay, so if we are all living in this corporate matrix, how do the authors think you can escape it? Well, they outline a pretty complex pseudo-legal process. First, you have to correct your personal, political status on the public record. Second, reclaim your property and major trust funds. And finally, file a private registered indemnity bond. Basically applying high-level corporate finance logic to human beings, the text claims this step requires 1 indemnity and 2 guarantors, officially filed with the Treasury, to offset your debt and finally remove you from the jurisdiction of the corporate state.
Wow, we have unpacked an incredibly dense and complex interpretation of American history today. It's a lot to process, right? But it leaves us with a really compelling question to ponder. Why do these intricate, alternative legal mythologies hold such appeal for certain groups today? It really highlights the enduring psychological weight of America's founding documents and how the search for individual sovereignty continues to manifest in some truly fascinating ways. The constitutional era reshaped American government through the creation of a new constitutional framework while preserving many principles established during the nation's founding period.